This is Black and Navy Blue, a look at the African American pioneers of Navy music. I'm Senior Chief Musician Mike Bays with the United States Navy Band in Washington, D.C. We all understand what music can do to people. It can entertain or make us happy, sad, or thoughtful. But there's so much more it can do. In the words of Dr. Martin Luther King, music can strengthen us when courage fails. It can calm us when spirits are down. And sometimes music can lead the way to better understanding in a society torn apart by racial injustice and discrimination. That's a role that music has played in the history, of all places, of the United States Navy. For a long time, there were severe restrictions on what kind of jobs African Americans could have in the Navy. But when it finally came time for that policy to end, it was musicians who were among the first African Americans to be let in. Our Navy's had an up and down record when it comes to race. In America's early years, the Navy was actually the only place where African Americans could serve. That's according to Joseph Reedy, a professor of history at Howard University. For the first 25 years of American history, he says,
only white men were bound to serve in the militias.
Militias were what America had before we had an army. When the U.S. Army was created, they kept that whites-only policy in place. But Dr. Reedy says,
there was nothing in the founding legislation that established the U.S. Navy that restricted the enlistments only to white men, as was the case for the Army.
So for a long time, there were African Americans in the Navy. A lot of them.
From the 1830s down through the 1850s, about 5% of the U.S. Navy consisted of men of African descent.
1,500 African American men were in the Navy in the Revolutionary War. And a black fife player and seaman named Cyrus Tiffany helped save the life of Commodore Perry during the War of 1812. During the Civil War, the Navy was having trouble finding enough sailors. And at the same time, as ships moved into the South, word passed among slaves that the Northerners could set them free. According to Dr. Reedy,
African American men and women began running away from slavery and seeking safety with the Navy. So often they would take control of a small boat or a canoe on the shore and make their way to a naval vessel, ask for protection, and in the case of the men, offer their services.
By 1864, more than 25% of the United States Navy was black.
Hurrah, hurrah, we bring the Jubilee. Hurrah, hurrah, the flag that makes you free.
We don't know much about the music on ships in those early days, but we know it was there because sailors have played instruments for centuries. So we know about an African American musician on the sloop of war, USS Kearsarge, which set sail from Maine in 1861.
There's an account by a man named Charles Fisher who served on Kearsarge. He talks about the brass band that they had, and he and other African Americans were very instrumental in that.
There's another story about a black sailor from New York City who liked to go to Broadway shows.
So he was picking up the latest music. He could carry that on board ship with him, along with some New York-made instruments as well.
We even have pictures of African American musicians on board Navy ships.
There's photographs, I think it's from USS Hunchback, where it's clearly a posed photograph of the crew. And the most prominent feature of it is an African-American man with a banjo sitting right in the front of the line of the sailors who are posing for the picture.
Life was much better for African Americans in the years right after the Civil War. In the South, blacks could vote for the first time and go to school. There was a real possibility that black and white Americans might come to see each other as equals. But it didn't last. As we came closer to the 20th century, racism roared back. In the South, blacks and whites couldn't eat in the same restaurants, use the same water fountains or bathrooms, and the inequality between blacks and whites got worse. This held not just in civilian life, but in the Navy too. as Dr. Reedy says.
There are reports, for example, where there is such animus by white crewmen against the black that it almost sounds like seething warfare barely below the surface.
In 1913, President Wilson signed a law that segregated all government offices, including the Navy, so blacks couldn't enlist anymore. And according to Mark Clegg, a professor of African American culture at the University of Michigan, for the men who were already in, they restricted the kinds of jobs they could do.
African Americans were limited in the Navy to being basically cooks, assistants to cooks, and then valets for senior white officers.
3 years later, in 1916, the United States bought a chain of islands from Denmark, the place we now call the U.S. Virgin Islands. And believe it or not, this had an important impact on the Navy, on race relations, and on music in America.
There was the first colored band master in the United States Navy, and they were the first colored band in the United States Navy.
That's the voice of Alton Adams. Who was Alton Adams? Well, imagine a young man who wants to learn music. There's no place to do it, but he does it anyway. Now imagine he's in a place where no one treats him like a person, but he's able to turn that around and become an important leader in the Navy. That's Alton Adams. As Mark Clegg says,
it's an amazing story.
Alton Adams grew up in the U.S. Virgin Islands. When he was a boy, even if you wanted to, you couldn't become a musician. There were no music teachers, so Alton became a shoemaker. But one day he was unpacking a box of equipment, and it was wrapped in pages from a music magazine. He sent away for a subscription, and he signed up for a correspondence course. That's where you write out your lessons, put them in an envelope.
It's put on a boat and then brought to the United States, gets to the way to Chicago, his homework is corrected by his teacher, and then sent back to him, and it goes back and forth.
The United States had just taken over the Virgin Islands from Holland when Alton Adams was a young man. In order to gain control of this new territory, the United States government called on the Navy.
There's a lot of racial discrimination within the Navy at this time.
The islands had never had racial discrimination before, and a lot of people there were worried what the Navy would bring. Bands and band music were very popular all over the world at that time, and the Navy thought a good way to create better relations on the island was to form a Navy band. To everyone's surprise, they turned to Alton Adams, a black man, to start this new band. They picked Adams because he was local and because he had a very strong musical background. In 1917, the Navy made Alton Adams a bandmaster.
The band leader was an officer and had a leadership position, and so to have African Americans serve these roles was really inconceivable.
There's an amazing story that shows how true that was. When the band was created, the Navy took pictures of all the bandsmen for their ID cards. The pictures were in black and white. They took the pictures on the island, but they sent them to the U.S. to get processed. When the pictures came back, Mark Clegg says,
all the bandsmen look white, and the reason for that is that they changed the exposure on the negatives when they did the printing, because it was inconceivable that these musicians could be black, because there were no black musicians in the Navy at this time.
Alton Adams' experience as a boy woke him up to the power of music as a tool for education.
I went to the schools, and I went to certain homes, and I gathered young kids from 8 to about 15, 16 years old.
That's where he found the people who made up the United States Navy Band of the Virgin Islands.
This picture was taken at Howard University during the tour of the band sent by the Navy to the Eastern Seaboard to advertise these Virgin Islands as tourist resorts.
The band toured the entire eastern United States. They played Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, and when they came to Harlem in New York, Adams says the reception was amazing.
When we played in New York, people from the islands, thousands and thousands of them, people who have been there 30 years, they came out. They wanted to hear that band. People cried and cried.
The military made lots of promises to African Americans before and during World War I. But once the war was over, race in America went back to how it was before. Alex Albright is a professor at East Carolina University.
The Navy became more segregated, the world was more segregated, and then you have this build-up to World War II, and the same thing starts all over again.
The same thing for the Navy when ships go to sea. All they got is a mess boy's job for me, Uncle Sam says. Keep on your apron, son.
In fact, as America entered World War II, the Navy brought Alton Adams out of retirement to lead a Navy band in Cuba.
He took over a unit of all white musicians, and many of the white musicians actually wrote their congressman at that moment and resigned from the band because they couldn't accept being conducted by a black man.
The Navy secretary was dead set against integrated units. But just like during the Civil War, the Navy needed sailors. So Alex Albright says,
The idea came about to allow segregated units. Eleanor Roosevelt in 1940 is the first documented record I can find of someone suggesting that one of the ways to move forward towards integration was to have all black bands in the Navy.
Once again, the Navy turned to music as a way to try and solve its racial problems.
The Navy said we're going to have 4 black Navy bands.
There was a marching band at North Carolina A&T in Greensboro, which was an all-black college in the years when World War II broke out. Abe Thurman played piccolo and trumpet there.
Our first rehearsal in the new year, which was 42 in January 42, there was a man in a uniform standing in the band room along with the band director, and everybody was wondering who was that guy with the uniform with the band director.
They started rehearsal, and Abe says that after a few minutes, the man in the uniform stood up.
But he just stood up and said, "I'll take all of you." And everybody thought, "What are you talking about, take all of you?" And so he stood up and told us the Navy was recruiting black musicians which would be stationed at the University of North Carolina for the duration of the war.
Abe and his friends were one of the first groups of black enlisted men to enter naval service in World War II. In an all-white Navy, they had plenty to prove.
Everybody knew on the base that we were good marchers. And so at one time they put us on a white drill field and we out-drilled everybody. And from that point on, they told those drill instructors they didn't want to bring us on the drill field with the white anymore.
The new band, their official name was the B-1 Band, became a showcase for the Navy. They'd play out in public at rallies and other events and show off with flashy march cadences and fancy steps.
We were actually a recruiting band. The kids would hear that and then they say, "I want to do that, I want to join the Navy," and so forth and so forth. Well, we just tell them, well, you go over there and raise your right hand and they'll take you in.
We don't want to give too sunny a picture here, because as Alex Albright of East Carolina University says, there were still racial tensions in North Carolina at this time.
We have conflicting reports about their first march into town. Some people say that things were thrown at them, but others say that they don't remember that. There was trouble, not overt trouble, but people being refused service. But because of the nature of these bandsmen, they're just incredible young men, they sort of broke down those barriers.
They thought we were going to cause trouble. We caused no trouble. We made the community proud of us.
The black community still to this day, the ones living, talk about how proud they were to see those young men marching from those barracks. So they were really exemplary citizens, and it seems very clear that some barriers were broken down during their stay here.
The B-1 Band was one of a number of experiments the Navy conducted in World War II to try and break down racial barriers. By 1948, the Navy integrated completely, helping to lead the way to the civil rights movement that started a few years later. And the pioneers of the B-1 Band paved the way for African American musicians who came up through the Navy. African American musicians have stood by their fellow sailors in the cause of freedom and liberty around the world. These sailors not only served their country, but also fought for social justice. Their story is a rich narrative of the spirit of our nation's complex history. These pioneers stand as beacons for our future. Thanks for listening. I'm Senior Chief Musician Mike Bays with the United States Navy Band for Arts Edge, a program of the Education Department of the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts.